Convo Couch, Pasta and Fiorella, thanks for being on the show.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for bringing us on the show, Kim.
So we're going to get right to it. How did the DNC rig the primary? Because I know you guys were on the ground. Your show was on the ground. Where did you guys went to Iowa and New Hampshire? Is that right?
Yeah, so I
Vegas.
so
And
I
wow.
specifically went to Iowa, and we all went to New Hampshire, and I also went to Las Vegas, and we saw the vast differences depending on where we were, but we also saw a commonality among the type of machines used. So we can get into that in a
Yeah.
second.
I mean, when you ask me how did they rig the election, let me just say this much. We'll never be able to produce a smoking gun for you. A lot of people say, unless you can give us a smoking gun, then you have no proof. But here's the proof that you can't provide us. You can't provide us the proof that it was really fair. You know why? Because all the states, all 50 of them, have something called closed proprietary software
Mhm.
in their tabulation machines. When I say tabulation machines, I mean the machines that actually count the ballots. So I can't give you the smoking gun that it was fixed, but you can't give me the proof that it wasn't fixed. But we have a lot of other things that could be used in a court of law, like motive, like tactics, like a confession that we can show you that it's a strong proof that we think it was fixed once again.
And election fraud encompasses a lot of things. It's an overarching giant umbrella, because within election fraud, there's also voter suppression, which is undeniable. And that also happened in 2016. Then you have the machine, which is the machines are, like he says, they're not open source. They are controlled by corporations, by specific private entities, and we don't have access to them. And then you have the DNC and their rules, and those are formed in a way to completely keep the public out of any sort of knowledge. So we can just go over exactly what happens state by state, and we can also tell you the differences between what we mean by election fraud and within it voter suppression versus what like a lot of the right focuses on, which is voter fraud, which
Mhm.
is a whole other thing that can also be used to rig elections. But one of the things that I want to go back to is that this isn't the first time we've even dealt with this. There are countless documentaries online showing how these machines can be hacked, but there's also, we can go back to Florida, Bush versus Al Gore in 2000, in the year 2000, and we can look at that and how everybody even today repeats, oh yeah, that was totally rigged. But the thing is, when it comes from the Democrats saying it, it has to be a Republican doing it. It's always been this bipartisan issue, and we have to stop that sort of mindset. If one of them can do it, if Russians can hack our elections,
Mhm.
then why can't we hack our own elections, right?
Yeah.
And that's a really good point because the DNC has always been saying, "Oh, it's the Russians. The Russians, look what they did. They're the ones they're the reason for Donald Trump because they somehow got in there and rigged it in some way." But then when you say, "Okay, well, you guys rig elections," they say, "Oh no, we do not. We how
Yeah.
dare you accuse us of this?"
Yeah.
Sort of thing.
And
I mean, one thing though, before we get into all of the evidence that you guys have of it being rigged, um, I think one thing people don't realize is that the DNC, I'm pretty sure they could just do whatever they want, and they're
yeah.
allowed to have any nominee that they want. In the end, they don't even have to have elections. And so I think that's kind of an important point for people to understand as to how could they get away with rigging. I don't know if it's illegal for them to rig
Yeah.
it.
Right.
It's not. That's what the Jared Beck case proved. And that's what I said. We have a confession from DNC lawyers that say, hey, listen, regardless what you show us, we can go into the back room filled with cigar smoke and pick whoever we want. And because of that case, it's pretty much set a mandate that cheating is now legal. And don't get me wrong, Kim, there's multiple tactics they use. It's not just one tactic. It's voter suppression, it's the tabulation, it's the registration issues where they kick people into provisionals. There's even a mail-in scam. So it's all these tactics in one. But yes, you are right. It's pretty much legal to go against your own charter. That's what
Right.
Yeah.
that case proved.
Because they're a private corporation. I
Yep.
know,
Exactly.
a lot of us just don't realize what we're doing, how this whole system works. We all think, okay, we're living in a democracy and we go and we vote for the person that we want, and then it's fair. They count those votes and the best man or woman wins, right?
Mhm.
And people don't realize that no, this is a private corporation they're able to, and in years past, they didn't even have primaries in every single state. They had primaries only in, I believe, maybe in the 60s, or maybe further before that. There was only 10 states that were able to even have primaries. I think maybe that was in the 20s or 30s. And then, they kind of slowly said, okay, we'll let more states get in on this. And the fact that they're able to have super delegates, all of these rules they make. And so I think people need to understand that I don't think it's illegal for them to break the rules. They could maybe be sued by us, but in the end, I don't know what kind of recourse we would even have as voters when the judge would say, well, it's their own company, and I guess they can do things the way they want, however they want.
Exactly.
But this also is why we don't get any transparency.
Charter?
What's that?
I mean, can you go against your own charter? That's the argument. The DNC went against their own charter. They pretty much lied. They committed fraud, but yet they were some way, they were able to squeal out of it. And that's what we have to do. We have to make all our voter laws, not just for the general election, but for all primaries, whatnot. And if somebody commits voter fraud, they have to pay the price. Nobody's paid the price.
Right. Yeah, I guess it would be similar to contesting laws, maybe. I mean, you can't launch a contest. Like McDonald's can't launch their whatever contest that they do and then change the rules in the middle of it, or change the way that they decide on who's winning. I guess they could just rig it on the backside and say, well, we weren't really clear on it. We never really said that that's what was going to happen. Okay, so let's get into the actual evidence. Because, there are people like myself, there's several that we just think Bernie Sanders ran a bad campaign.
Which he did.
And yeah, I mean, he ran a bad campaign. He shifted his message away from the workers and the class and the money aspect, and started talking, I think, heavy on identity politics issues. Didn't stand up for other people that, like Tulsi Gabbard, when they were being shafted by the DNC. So he kind of lost some credibility there. People would just like to see him standing up for others who are being raked over the coals, kind of a thing. And there was also reports that a lot of Republicans were registering as Democrats in order to ensure Bernie didn't get the nomination. I don't know if you guys saw much of that on the ground.
I don't believe that. I don't. For Republicans, from what I've seen from going to New Hampshire and Iowa, Vegas all the time, Arizona, it's really hard for a Republican to go to Democrat. They just don't want to do it. So
they'll like for instance, they'll be like, when we met some in New Hampshire, they're like, oh, we like Tulsi Gabbard, but yeah, we'll just see what happens after the primary. Like they'd be willing to vote even for Bernie Sanders too. A lot of them like Bernie Sanders, but they'd be willing to vote in the general, not in the primary. And there's also lots of states that keep them from doing that legally. Like they can't do that once they're a Republican.
Yeah, and also open primaries. I think you saw, a couple of our videos, and I've talked to, Tulsi when I've interviewed her, how strong she is for open primaries. Not only does it force you to talk to the other side, but it creates, it eliminates a lot of the registration problems, which keep people from voting for who they want to vote for and get kicked to a provisional. So open primaries is so important. Once again, the fact that the DNC is not allowing open primaries is a kind of form of suppression to keep other people from voting for the outsider candidate.
Well, a lot of people say, well, somebody that's not a part of this party, that hasn't been loyal, they use that word a lot. The people that haven't ever been loyal to this party shouldn't be allowed to have a say in who the candidate is. So they're really playing on the party side of it rather than what the American people want. Most people, I don't think, identify with either party. I think most people are independent.
Yeah.
And so they require you to pledge allegiance in order to vote in their primary.
Right.
But that's a big problem, right? Because
stupid. If you want to grow the party, right? And they always say that they contradict themselves. You want to grow the party, but we want to have loyalists in there. What do you want? Which one? Because if you want to grow the party, have open primaries. Let people come on in and vote, So
yeah. So tell us, what was like the biggest, okay, this is I guess the most obvious way that they rigged it in your mind, or the most egregious way?
The most egregious way that it was obviously rigged, and I can go back to California the most because we really saw that firsthand, all of us did, where it was a campaign of disinformation to the voters and even to officials and the entire campaigns. And I don't want to say that the Bernie staff knew this, But I want to say that they were completely inept in dealing with it, because what happened in California was, for over a year and a half, they had been training us and talking to us about this whole new system that was going to take place in LA County. And it was a system that had the ballot marking devices, and the machines were going to be electronic. It was going to be completely different than what we had initially the years before. And this was a rollout of an experiment, so to speak, to figure out exactly how this was going to happen, like exactly how they were going to go about it. And Pasta and I attended several meetings by Dean Logan's surrogates. One of them was named Jeff Klein. And they basically told us, oh, this is going to be great. You're going to have 11 days to vote. We're going to go from 4,000 centers to 1,000, but it's okay because you're going to have 11 days to vote. You can register the day of, et cetera, et cetera. But what they failed to tell people was that if you register the day of, you were going to get a provisional ballot. They also failed to tell people that those machines weren't even, they didn't meet the standards to be used, meaning like when they were used, there was too many errors.
Independent test.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what happened was that they still went on and used them anyway. They also didn't tell us that they weren't going to give people proper training, and they gave people a day training. And by people, I mean the poll workers. They give the poll workers 1 day of training. These people are volunteers. They were never trained on this before. And they told them the wrong information, because the information that was coming in for them changed as time went on. And so what happened is they gave the campaigns the wrong information. They said, oh yeah, these people, anybody can come in and register. If you're an independent, you can totally just register the day of. If you've never been registered before, you're a new voter, you can register the day of. But what happened is they were overwhelmed, because when people went in to register, they were given a provisional ballot, or they couldn't be found on the voter roll, which is something that we saw in 2016. People were like, oh, I swear I registered, but I wasn't found on the voter roll. Yeah. So that was one issue. They weren't found on the voter roll. The machines were spitting out ballots. The machines, like I said, weren't tested adequately. They didn't meet the standards. So they were spitting out ballots. They were having issues with the machines. They didn't have enough tech people on there. They didn't have enough machines working for the amount of people that came in. For instance, in a college, they had about 10 machines and like 2 people in the room for a college of thousands of people. And so all of these little things added up and created these 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hour lines that then becomes voter suppression, because people are waiting for hours and they can't, and some of them had to leave.
Yeah. I just want to say to make sure we have to understand voter trends too as well. When you're in this game, Kim, it gets really nuanced. It's not as simple as just counting A or B. Early voting always tends to favor the more moderate to conservative candidate. It's always been that way. The older people, 1/3 of the older people use the mail-in ballots. So most of your mail-in ballots come in early. Later voters tend to be more, liberal to progressive, very consumed younger people. It's that sticker on that day I voted. It's kind of that holiday. It's always been that way when it comes to voting. And I have numbers to kind of prove that, where you hear that Biden got a lot of the older vote, but he didn't get any of the younger vote, and the younger vote didn't turn out. Well, that's what's going on, what Fiorella's talking about, because it is a form of suppression in what I call the front of the house, the non-tabulation part, the front of the house, how we run our elections. And when you know the people, you can start to see their intent. We were up these people's asses saying, hey, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? How are you going to train people? In a 2018, or was it a 2016 documentary from TYT, they showed how they put out a broken system. Therefore, they maintain order through chaos. Nobody knows how to work the system. They're not properly trained. So now you have all these long lines. I mean, by God, the donation for pizza in lines for LA was ridiculous. People would donate money to bring pizza to people in line. Yeah. Well, can you just imagine a mother showing up that has a babysitter or a dog sitter, or guys who have a job and got to get to another job? All those young voters were thrown on out. And when you simply look at the data, there's almost the same amount of votes in 2020 than there is in 2016 for this primary. Again, where are all the missing votes? But to me, the elephant in the room is still the tabulation machines. I know I can sit there and I can quote exit polls or regular polls, but the tabulation machine to me is still the most destructive thing when it comes to our election. And in all 50 states, it's proprietary software. Alex Padilla tried to call a press conference where he was saying that we have an open source software new system in Los Angeles, which he was trying to claim the front of the house, the actual ballot marking devices were open source, which they kind of were, but the tabulation machines were still the same tabulation machines that we cannot look in. And when you only have a 1% audit and a tabulation machine that has proprietary software, you can do anything. So they didn't want to be transparent at all, Kim.
Well,
they want to keep us in the dark.
And they have USBs. They have USB access, SD card,
internet in the room.
Yeah. So even though they tell you, yes, it's not connected to the internet, it actually, the voter roll is where the people's information is. All of that was directly connected to the internet, and people who could have access to it could absolutely go in and change. And we've seen some of our friends who have been in smaller races, whether it was for Senate or Congress, we're seeing, for instance, the votes coming in and their specific race not changing at all while everything else was changing. That was Maria Estrada, who ran for state assembly.
Magic.
And it's kind of like, it's called fraction magic. And it's a concept that's hard to understand for most people, but it's basically just a manipulation of numbers where you're seeing that, everything else is going along. You're seeing the tabulation for everything else, but the specific candidates aren't at all changing.
Yeah.
And one thing before, I just want to point out, it's very important to point out that the provisional ballots, Pasta and I and several other voter integrity activists went into the place where they hold all these provisional ballots. And if you go in this room, anybody could go in there and look, and you have to sign up. But they were literally watching us. I mean, they had the lead guy, Jeff Klein, come in and take us, escort us there. And so it's a giant room where you see all these provisional ballots. And provisional ballots are the famous pink ballot. And Greg Palast calls them the placebo ballots because they're never really counted. I mean, they are, but it's a process where they have to verify that you are allowed to vote. So it's a vote. It's a way to get verified again, to go through the whole system again. So when you go in that room, there was so many thousands, hundreds of thousands of provisional ballots, and there was people there going over them to see where they would go next. There was a green light, a red light, and a yellow light, different types of categories for these ballots to then be moved to Downey in California, which is
another validation.
Which is where they go next. But the point I want to make is that the people who are hired to count these ballots are seasonal workers. They have zero to do with election stuff. They put it out on Craigslist. They put it out on Indeed. They hire these people and they just train them on the spot. Oh, look for this, and that. If it doesn't have that, then it goes here.
Yeah.
And it's a whole mess because they only have a certain amount of time to count these ballots. And if they don't count them, they just don't get counted. And a lot of the names that we saw on there, Latino, first time voter, and you can see the reason for them being given a provisional ballot. A lot of those said machine not working, machine spit this out, and they were given provisional ballots to everybody. We went the night before because was it Dean Logan had put out this press conference saying, or this press release saying that, okay, we're going to give people more time to vote. And we're going to start out the night before March 3rd. So it was March 2nd, and it was going to go on all the way through March 3rd at 8 p.m. So we went at around midnight.
Yeah.
Was it around midnight?
11 o'clock-ish.
Yeah, to a location in East LA. It was called the East LA Doctors Hospital, I believe. And so we went in there, and we were in line, and Pasta was going to go and drop off his ballot. And we started seeing provisional ballots be given everywhere. And we have a video that was on Twitter. It went viral where the guy is telling people provisional ballots are the same thing as a regular ballot. And he was giving it to people. And the reason he was giving it to people was because the machines weren't working and they weren't fixing it in time. So they were just giving everybody in that line provisional ballots. Now that area is working class Latino population. And so all of those votes that these people were filling out, some of them couldn't even speak English, were not going to be counted right away. So the problem with that is when the mainstream media gets the first few votes, it's always going to show like the first initial votes. And that's what he's talking about, which tend to be more conservative. as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
But Bernie
remember-
won California.
Sorry.
He won California. So, I mean, California, even
He
if they
did.
did do all of this rigging here, he still did take this state.
He did.
Yeah,
So-
but it's not about him winning. It's about how much he won, and it's also
How
about
much
what
they
Joe
shaved
Biden
off.
got.
Right.
Remember, you need to get 15% viability to even get the main chunk of the delegates in this state. And there's also, we talk about the provisional ballots, which kind of suppress one type of vote over another. The register spent the whole year saying that he was implementing this system to get us away from provisional ballots. And it didn't do that. It did the opposite. And then you have also the mail-in scam as well, where you have a lot of dead people getting mail-in ballots that are coming now that, they don't know where they come from. This was an old tactic used by the Democrats when it came to Kennedy and Nixon and the two areas in Illinois where his daddy had a good spot. And then in Texas, Lyndon Johnson, there was another area where they had a bunch of dead people, mail-in ballots as well. So there's all these ways to suppress and mess with these votes.
And that's mainly what happened in California. So you talk about Bernie Sanders winning. Joe Biden got 28% of the vote. Joe Biden didn't campaign here at all. He didn't
go to any of the
conventions. Didn't go to any of the conventions.
Right. I have a hard time believing he got that many. I mean, I will say, most of the people I know did mail in. And I did mail in. I don't think my vote was counted because I got the wrong ballot. Well, I got the right ballot, but it was my mistake. I had registered for that stupid far right party.
Independent.
Yes, the same thing.
Yes, I am registered as an American independent thinking, well, I'm an independent, right? No, it turns out that's some like weird far right. And like everybody that's in that party are all just a bunch of people thinking I was an independent, I thought, right? So I ended up getting that ballot, even though I had changed when I realized my mistake, I changed parties and I said, oh no, I want the Democrat ballot. I wanted the just the no party preference ballot, right? And I ended up getting the American Independent ballot. So I just wrote in Bernie Sanders. That's what I did.
Yeah.
So I doubt that was ever counted. I kind of wondered about that. I didn't end up getting the no party preference ballot until after the election. Yeah, that's when it showed up for me.
By the way, statistic here, 17,000 people inexplicably didn't get their vote by mail ballot.
I didn't get my ballot. I never got and I realized my mistake well in advance and switched. And I definitely should have received my no party preference ballot. Yeah. And so I just finally filled out the American Independent ballot and just, put in Bernie Sanders. But I know a lot of other people who did mail-in ballots, the people that are centrists, and they voted so early that they voted for people like Klobuchar.
Yeah.
They weren't voting for Biden.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because she was still in the race. I mean, there were still plenty of people in the race when a lot of people filled out their ballots. So that is the one thing that when I saw the results for California that Joe Biden got as many as he did, it was like, that's not really that believable considering so many people already mailed in before all these others had dropped out.
That's the thing. It wasn't just against Bernie Sanders because they really didn't know who was going to be the leader at that. I mean, in the beginning, they were trying out every single type of candidate. So what they needed to do was just keep Bernie Sanders low enough because it didn't really matter which of the people they chose. It was just as long as he was low enough. And in California, you could go walk to every house. You could go knock on people's doors and ask them, hey, by the way, like, who did you vote for? And they're likely going to say Bernie Sanders. I mean, even with all the stuff we're talking about, he still won. And it's not enough for him to have won, though, because what we're looking at here is that they shaved off just enough for him for this lead to not be as big.
Right.
And that's
well, and we all know Iowa was like a total cluster.
Right. We can talk about Iowa too.
That was an obvious rigging.
Yeah.
And whether, I mean, it was because they were just doing things like coin tosses. And then in the end, Pete Buttigieg ended up with 2 more delegates than Bernie in the end, but he had like how many more votes or less? No, he had less votes. I mean, that is.
Yeah.
So Iowa, right? Like we learned about the shadow app. Right. And just flat out, if they can have a shadow app in Iowa, what's to stop them from having some sort of system to do something in every other state? right?
What's
Because
to
if
stop
it
the
happened in
Russians
Iowa-
from hacking it?
Exactly. And so the thing that the Bernie Sanders campaign did there that I will applaud them for is that they had their own app. And
Yeah.
that's why they were able to claim what they claimed. But also journalists were on the ground. And I happened to be in Precinct 80. And Precinct 80 was where there was an infamous coin toss there where she literally, a woman, her name was Tabitha, she waited until Tina and I left. And they had already said, and we were pressed, and they had already said, okay, well, it looks like Bernie Sanders gets 5 delegates. Pete Buttigieg gets 3 because that's how the math worked out. And so then they were calling it and they were fine. And they were choosing the people specifically who were going to be their delegates representing them in the convention. And so we were like having to go to another event. So we were like, okay, let's go. Then we get a notification from one of the Bernie people that was there, and they had all of a sudden had a coin toss. So she waited till all of us left because there was 2 of us that were filming and another one that was a writer, and we had all left.
Yeah.
And they did the coin toss there, giving Buttigieg 5 delegates. No, 5 delegates, and Bernie 5 as well. So they tied. And so we blasted it. We took it to the campaign. We let the campaign know. And basically they were able to get that delegate back. Yeah. But it was because multiple people were watching and like they had the app and they had the backup.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
we
was
were
part
like,
of
hey,
it.
we just think they're doing a coin flip in the caucus that you just left. And you said Bernie Sanders had like 130 to Pete Buttigieg's 60. What's going on?
Yeah.
We were like, what? And she's like, wait, they waited till we left. The press leaves. But and you see these tactics all the time. When you were just talking about the California situation in Los Angeles, the registrar went around, and especially when Maria Estrada asked him in a meeting too as well, we have a provisional ballot. He's like, don't worry. The new system will let you show up, change your status from whatever party you are, and get a Democratic ballot, and then you can vote conditionally. So he kind of obfuscated. He didn't tell us what conditionally meant. Well, conditional ballots are the new provisional 2020 ballots for the Gen Xers and the Gen Zers.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It goes in the same pile. It has to go through the same steps to get validated. In other words, a set of human eyes have to look at it to make sure that ballot's okay, as opposed to a regular ballot that gets counted.
And not to mention, Kim, and back to Iowa, not to mention the inconsistencies and the kind of like just conflicts of interest happening between the Buttigieg campaign and the Iowa state legislator and the state people, because the person who used to work obviously for who worked at the Shadow app had ties to Pete Buttigieg's campaign directly, and a lot of the people who were in charge of the elections in Iowa were Pete Buttigieg supporters. So that was when they were trying to make Pete Buttigieg happen, and they admitted to this. And the Bernie Sanders campaign had an app to support what they were saying. They also had people on the ground that they had the precinct captains who had knowledge of everything that was going on. And that's something that I wish they would have done throughout every single state. Now, caucuses are different because in a caucus, you can see the vote happening in real time.
Right.
And that is what is great about caucuses, because they are paper ballots. They're like one person, one vote.
And they're transparent. I mean, if you see that the area you were in, all of a sudden they say Biden when you know it was Sanders or whoever, you're like, wait a minute, no, I was there. There's just too many people who were there to see it with their own eyes. So it's
and that's
much
why
harder.
Nevada went the way it did, because after Iowa, everybody was on it. All the media were there. They stopped using a lot of the app. So the apps that they were going to use in our where I went at the Bellagio, they didn't use the app. They just used the paper ballots. And Bernie Sanders won in a landslide, even with the union leaders lying to their union members about the healthcare situation, saying that he was going to take their healthcare away and all this stuff. They showed up in their uniform, and it was, again, majority working class, minority populations that work in these casinos, and they showed up and voted for him. And I think if we would have seen that sort of transparency, we would have very, very different results throughout the United States now.
And all these new systems too, Kim. This, first of all, it's all the same people from 2016 to 2020. And they maintain order by creating these chaotic systems. People shouldn't have to wait 4, 5, 6, 7 hours to vote. And like I said, a lot of those votes that were in line, they were the working class people. They were the late hippie Bernie bras. in LA that were going to vote late and stuff. So the fact that they created all these new systems made sure that nobody was trained. We were in Jeff Klein's face. Hey, man, this is a brand new system. You got to get a week of training. At the time, I was coming out of my restaurant management jobs, and I was saying, I've opened restaurants before. You have to take this serious. We don't want the same thing that happened in 2016 to happen in 2020. But in all these new states, you see it in Texas, Los Angeles, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Washington. It's all these new systems. And when the most important election of our time, no. I believe it was 100% by design. And all that late vote got suppressed. And it didn't go for Bernie Sanders.
That's the thing. You can Texas too, with the missing USBs that were never found. I mean, that's part of it too. But he said it right there. If this had affected different candidates throughout, it would have been okay. Like, okay, they just didn't. It was just incompetence. They just didn't have their shit together. This is America. There's a point where you cross the line of incompetence, and then it's like it's obvious that this is intent, because it always went against Bernie Sanders. It always hurt Bernie Sanders in the entire process, whether it was in Texas, whether it was in Iowa, whether it was in California. And we can even go as far in recently as to the Super Tuesday states, where it was just not the Super Tuesday states, I'm sorry, the Arizona, Illinois, Florida, where they were completely trying to go ahead with the election regardless of the pandemic we have. I mean, they were just set on having it. Same thing with Wisconsin, because Wisconsin, they were so intent on having it. And the Democrats now all of a sudden want to blame Republicans, but the Democratic governor chose not to do anything until he was grandstanding in front of the Republican legislator who completely opposed it. But he knew all along that they wanted this to happen. And now we're finding out that Biden and Obama were the ones pushing Wisconsin to go through. And when you consider why would they be so intent on having this primary on this day, it's because they already have the numbers that they need set up.
Exactly.
And that seems kind of like ridiculous to say, but it is very
you
true.
have all that mail-in information. You have data sitting there. Now, you can either manipulate that data, or if you have good data, I got a lot of mail-in votes for Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Well, let's have a primary during the middle of the coronavirus. Why? Because we're going to have a low voter turnout.
Right.
Who's that going to affect? Bernie Sanders. He's going to get all that late voting. That's just the way it goes. So by doing so, they suppress his vote, and they already have the information there. That's why they were so adamant about having this primary go on in Wisconsin, because they wanted to further put the knife in. It's like, hey, see, Bernie, you lost. Now you got to get out of this whole thing.
Well, yeah.
I mean, it definitely is very odd that Joe Biden ended up with the nomination. I mean, it was like this guy who had no momentum, who nobody cared about. He didn't win Iowa. He didn't win New Hampshire. Yeah. That hasn't happened in 50 years. A candidate on either side of the aisle not winning one of those two states and going on to actually be the nominee. This is the first time it's happened in decades. And it's just like, well, they got the guy that they said they wanted from the beginning, despite all of that. Yeah. And that part is where it's like, I don't know, I believe that you guys saw everything that you saw, and I definitely don't put it past the DNC to rig things or to make things so complicated or whatever they might have done to make sure their guy got the nomination. I definitely don't doubt that they're capable of all of that. But I mean, it just is insane that the guy they wanted all along ended up with it. Right. Even though none of us wanted him, and still don't. Everybody's watching him on television and are like, what the hell? What are we going to do with this guy? He can't even form a complete sentence. We thought Trump was bad with the way he speaks. Joe Biden's worse.
It just seems ultimately they don't really care about winning as long as the status quo is maintained. I mean, I genuinely think like they know that Joe Biden isn't the strongest candidate. They have to. And I think they just don't care as long as it's not Sanders or
Gabbard. I mean, they didn't want either of those. Yeah,
they definitely didn't want Gabbard, and that's the whole thing. Like, I think I think she was also kept out in places like New Hampshire because let me tell you, I was at the New Hampshire election, the primary election night, and I was with a lot of the Bernie staff and the Bernie supporter volunteers. And when the results started coming out, they were like, what? Like, this is weird. I mean, like, we checked our data because they have data. When you are a field organizer, you have certain numbers you have to get. And then in the app, it marks who's voting for Bernie. Well, all of that didn't match the results in New Hampshire. And so we're not looking here at just the places Bernie lost. We're looking at the amount he won by. Because even in Vermont, according to exit polls and according to several people who are there, and the same with New Hampshire, Bernie Sanders should have won that in a landslide, and he didn't. And it was so close with Pete Buttigieg in New Hampshire, and people were like, "Wait a minute, this is New Hampshire. Like, this doesn't make sense. We had so much more in the exit polls, and also our data as field organizers isn't matching this." But they didn't really have a specific app or anything to keep that like tally. But they were astounded with how close the result was in New Hampshire, and how Biden got such a large percentage of the vote. And we can talk about exit polls, because the argument against exit polls is that they're unreliable, that, you know, it's these private companies that they do it a certain way. We don't have control as to how they do it. And that's a really good argument. However, when you take that and you compare it to the Republican exit polls are within like 1%.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1 percentage point. And then you compare the Democratic exit polls, and they were like 8 to 11% difference. And it's like, okay, so are Republicans just better at doing this, or is it maybe that this is not okay?
And in New Hampshire, let me just tell you this much: Tulsi Gabbard, the same thing. I was at the rally that night, and somebody had come back from a precinct that they did hand counting, and it was really marked on. And she's the only one with new billboards in New Hampshire. We were driving all over New Hampshire, Kim. The only one with billboards. There was a presence there for Tulsi Gabbard, you know, and it's a lot of libertarian-minded people who were, you know, we were near a Trump rally 2 nights before the vote, and they were, oh, she's the only one we like. She's the only one we like. You know what I'm saying? So there was a lot of independent-minded people out there for Tulsi Gabbard. Would you believe it or not, and I hate to say this, the exit polls for the areas that use the AccuVote counting machines, these proprietary softwares, they were off. The areas that they did the hand counting, Tulsi was getting that 8, 9, 10% that we had talked about. But in those other areas where they use these machines where, once again, you can't look at it inside and show me that it was accurate, and I can't look inside to see if it was not accurate. We're just not allowed to look at it. It's owned by Dominion Voting or whoever, the 3 main corporations that own the majority of the elections, and that's why we got to fight for transparency. Well, once again, they were off in New Hampshire, but the hand counting was on. So, you know.
Yeah. And exit polls are real data. So when an exit poll, if people don't know, it's like when people have already voted. So that it's not like you're predicting how they're going to vote. It's you're relying.
You're asking them, who did you vote for?
Exactly.
And
so
they're telling you.
Exactly. And it's a little bit different than that. And that's why, while you shouldn't just rely on exit polls to show a rigged system, in the majority of other countries, if their exit polls vary as much as ours, they'd already have a huge investigation. We'd be seeing it in a court of law right now.
Bolivia.
I mean, this is we invade people and we
over
democratically elected
for Bolivia because of exit polls, but you know,
Venezuela. Oh, Venezuela.
Oh,
come on. But you know.
Somebody needs to start overseeing our elections, clearly.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Somebody needs to start overseeing our elections.
Well, there's so many areas to look for. The things we need to fight for: transparency. We need transparency 100% across the board. We need open software, open source. In other words, if it's a publicly funded election, we should have all the software data information, and it shouldn't be owned by a private corporation. We also need public counting. The chain of command, me and Johnny saw it been broken so many times. This is a thing called the chain of command when you talk about elections, the way everything is transported, the way everything is done, the way everything is looked at, the way everything is out in the open. It should never leave more than 2 humans' eyes at one time. You know what I'm saying? Ever. And we have the ability and the technology to do that. And we need a 100% audit with paper ballots. So in other words, that's just not about paper ballots. Is not going to fix everything, because you can rig the vote with just paper ballots too as well. We need all systems intact. We need a voting czar, as far as I'm concerned. But how do we vote in a voting czar when our vote systems don't work? They'll just vote another crony in, like Dean Logan here in Los Angeles. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's the big problem is that, they are going to get what they want and they want to keep the system in a way that they can rig it or manipulate it. I mean, even just with the way the press has handled the elections,
Right. That's a
even
form
just,
of it.
well, and the big, if it's not glaringly obvious to people how complicit the press is, now after this whole Tara Reid scandal with Joe Biden and the fact that the press didn't even say a word about her for weeks. I
Yep.
mean, if that doesn't wake people up, but of course it doesn't wake them up. I mean, they are just like, oh no, the press is fair. Those people are just bad.
Yeah.
Nobody likes Tulsi or nobody likes Bernie or whatever. And it's like, oh man, just it's so glaringly obvious
Yeah.
how they are, that
Yeah.
they're so in bed with this whole thing to brainwash Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's just, and Chris Cuomo had that moment the other day. You guys hear about that, where he had that moment where he was on a radio show and he trashed his job. And
Yeah.
then he came back and he says, okay, I didn't mean it. I really like my job. But it's like, whatever, you meant it in that moment. And in that moment, you said that you were basically spoon feeding bullshit to people,
Yep.
hyper partisan bullshit. And that's what you were doing for your job, and that it was absolutely meaningless, and that is what they're all doing. And it's just, it's all criminal. But I mean, that's why I don't think any of this will change, because what would be the DNC's incentive to change any of it when
It's
they
not
get
gonna
to,
come from them. Yeah. So like a lot of people are asking, like, where do we go from here? Like, how do we change the system? And what a lot of people miss is that we can change the system and it doesn't have to come from the electorate, right? The whole idea of Dem Enter was always to go in, change the Democratic Party, and be able to push progressives mentality in there and push these politicians left. Well, you're not going to do that because they have no incentive. Because as long as you continue to vote for the lesser of two evils, why should they stop doing what they're doing? If you're going to continue calling election integrity, election fraud a conspiracy theory, well, they can do this and get away with it. That's why they got away with it in 2016. They got away with it again. There's no incentive for them to give us anything.
Yeah.
I think we
Right.
have to do is stop voting for the lesser of evils. And whether you want to call it a protest or not, do whatever you can to hold the Democratic establishment accountable, because it is the Democrats that are doing this now more than the Republicans. They both do it. But at the end of the day, there are documentaries, like there's a one on HBO right now called
Jesus.
the Kill Chain. And it focuses on how these machines are easily hacked. And they say, oh my God, yeah, we can hack this. A 10-year-old hacked it. It's really easy to do. Anybody can do it, blah, blah, blah. But then what the documentary goes and does is blame it all on Russia, saying the Russians hacked our elections in 2016. The Russians did this. Well, they're proving our point, right? Because if the Russians can do it, what's to stop
right.
somebody at home from doing it?
Right.
So it's funny because this is what they focus on. But what we need to do is go outside the electorate and have a sort of demand that until our elections are fair, we're not gonna participate in this corrupt system, because it doesn't matter how much you want progressives or how much you want Tulsi Gabbard, Bernie Sanders. They're never going to win if you keep running them under a Democratic ticket or under a whole system in general
Right.
that keeps third parties from ever achieving viability, that keeps people's votes from actually going there. So you're never going to change it until you address that issue. And it doesn't only have to be addressed from the electorate. It can also be addressed from outside of the electorate via mass protests and mass attention, which is why talking about it is the first step, I think.
Well, look, his biggest sin, Bernie Sanders, this year, they've made some mistakes, Kim. We can talk about them all day.
Oh, yeah.
We do. But his biggest sin was not calling out the election rigging. And at the very least, get an audit. You have the money, you have the votes, you have the time, you have the resources.
Yeah.
Get an audit. Make sure that every single one of the people who voted for you, their vote counts. He never did that. You should have lawyers after the first Super Tuesday. You have people in places like, let's go, Bernie, let's do this. But once again, he refused to call it out. He refused to call the rigging. I don't know what it is that he might think that he doesn't want to look like a sore loser.
That's exactly what
but
it is.
It's once again opportunities lost in 2016, opportunities lost in 2020, and guess what? It's mainly the same people in 2020 that did it in 2016.
Yep.
In 2016 in Los Angeles, it was Dean Logan and Alex Padilla. Guess who it was in 2020? Dean Logan and Alex Padilla.
I just wonder if they
So-
have blackmail on these people. You know, when you think about how Bernie hasn't called it out, and you know that this is it for him. I mean, he's not going
Yeah.
to run again.
Yeah.
I don't even know if he's going to run for Senate again. You know, I mean, he's got to be thinking about retirement.
Yeah.
And then you think about even Tulsi Gabbard and how much integrity she's had throughout this entire process, only to turn around and endorse Joe Biden.
Yeah.
I mean, I just sit here and I wonder, and Elizabeth Warren, even how she flipped quickly to, you know, she kind of had some progressive ideas, and then she was trying to play both sides. You know, she's trying to play the progressive and keep the progressives happy while at the same time keeping the establishment happy. And it just makes you wonder, do they have blackmail on all of these people? And that's what gets them to just, you know, fall in line when they need to fall in line.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, the fact that Pete Buttigieg dropped out of the race after winning Iowa, you know, kind of winning Iowa and nearly winning New Hampshire, and he still like says, okay, I got to get out now, make way for Joe, who didn't win any of those, you know, who hasn't done shit.
Yeah.
Make way for Joe. And it's like, what do they have on all these people? They just went and must have got some internal spy network to go and dig up as much dirt on every single person they could and say, now you have to do exactly what we say.
I mean, I think there's an element to that. I also think there's an element of politics and how the establishment has always worked for the longest time, and how they dangle things in front of people. Like, if you do this, then we will give you this. And if you do that, and most people fall for it. As far as Bernie Sanders, I just genuinely think there's something more there. I agree with you that there's something there, because now he didn't not only address election integrity, he dropped out before the convention, and now he has zero leverage to get anything.
Right.
So
And that was after he said, we're going to, you know, my name is still on the ballot. We need to get as many delegates as possible so that we can basically use that as leverage to get them to move, to get them to budge. And then suddenly he says, I'm out. Never mind.
Like, what leverage? And that's also part of it, is the people on his campaign staff at the top. Faiz Shakir, Center for American Progress, Jeff Weber, all of the grassroots in 2016 wanted Jeff Weber out. He wasn't supposed to be a part of the campaign, and he ended up being one of his closest advisors. He surrounded himself with a lot of the wrong people, a lot of the people that kept him away from the foreign policy advocacy that Tulsi Gabbard had been pushing in 2016.
Yeah.
That's why you saw a different sort of campaign then, versus in 2020, like you said, he was focused on the identity politics. He was focused on Donald Trump is the most dangerous president in modern American history.
Right.
I don't know how many times you have to hear that to realize, Bernie, shut the hell up about that. Like, nobody cares.
Joe Biden is my friend.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Joe Biden's my
can be
friend, and
Trump.
Donald Trump is a racist, the most dangerous person on earth. And it was like, how are you going to win over those Trump voters who would have voted for you in 2016 had your name been on the ticket? And now you're saying the person they voted for is the most racist, dangerous president in the history of America. Those people are sitting there saying, no, Hillary Clinton would have been way worse. Yeah. And so, you know,
stop trying to feed us this. You're saying Joe Biden's your friend.
Right. And then you say Joe Biden's your friend, the guy who wrote the Patriot Act.
Well, the guy who's accused of rape.
Right. I mean, well, and that's why everybody's silent on that right now. You know, it's because if it's supposed to be the lesser of two evils, and you start comparing Joe Biden to Trump, and you're like, you know, Joe Biden has an actual history there of votes. He has a record of doing things. Like, Trump didn't write the Patriot Act. That was Joe Biden. You know, Joe Biden was the one who was cozying up with segregationists, not Trump. I mean, you can try to compare, right? You know, I mean,
Ukraine, what he did in the Ukraine was disgusting, because he's the one who gave the thumb up to Virginia Nuland, I believe her name was, to go ahead with regime change. And we don't talk about that because the press doesn't talk about that.
Right.
The press doesn't talk about the fact that in a debate, he just said he wanted to move 75% of the Navy into the South China Sea. Well, to me, that's World War III against China.
Right.
But nobody picks it up and talks about it. And you want me to vote for this guy over Donald Trump?
Right. Yeah.
Out of here.
Right.
You know?
It's not going to happen.
And Kim, also, we do have to talk about, you said, why do you think they do it? Is it the political thing? These are very, very dangerous people. I remember that when Tulsi Gabbard got that letter when she was persona non grata for leaving the DNC, on the bottom of that letter, there was a guy by the name of Michael Kives on that letter. Well, that guy has direct contacts with, like, you know, people in the Epstein clan. These are very, very powerful people. So you can only wonder what they're holding over people like Bernie Sanders and whatnot. So.
And just their family members. You know, I wonder, because I think Bernie is, you know, on his way out politically, just going to go and retire in Vermont or something. But, you know, maybe they said, well, no one who worked for you will ever work again. in Washington. Like everybody will be done. Just you can, even if you personally are there's nothing that they can do to you personally, they can still do a lot to people you care about.
Yeah.
And that is even more powerful oftentimes.
Yeah.
People will sacrifice themselves, but they won't sacrifice people they love.
And he has to work with the DNC according to the contract. Like that is a very real, where he has to not only endorse the nominee, but he has to go and fundraise for him. And that's what we're seeing now. He sent a DNC fundraising email actually as of recently. And that's the disgusting part, right? That we're just like, wait a minute. You guys stand, both you and Tulsi, opposed to everything Joe Biden is presenting.
Right.
Why are you all of a sudden endorsing them? And Bernie, far worse. He's not only endorsing Biden, he's telling everybody to support Joe Biden. And if you don't support him, that is irresponsible. And that's where you're seeing a lot of his supporters completely break up with him, break away, say, Bernie, I support the 40 years of work you've done. I admire you for bringing us this far along, but this is where we're done. We part ways here because we're not going to follow you into supporting the guy that has stood against everything you have said. I mean, you can find a video of Joe Biden advocating the Patriot Act and Bernie Sanders standing in opposing it. You can find a video of Joe Biden advocating Iraq, the crime bill, and Bernie Sanders standing in opposition to it. What is going on?
Right. I mean, it is very odd. And that's why a lot of people were so disappointed in Tulsi endorsing Joe, because it was like, this guy's a warmonger.
Well, she's a fighter too.
Yeah. But it just really makes you wonder, how powerful are they? And you're right. I mean, when we all start to really stop and think about it, we think of Epstein, and we think of what happened there. I mean, it does kind of give you pause a little bit to say, we are dealing with people that are very powerful.
Very dangerous.
And very dangerous. And we all know that on some level. And sometimes it's hard to then put it in like, it's easy when Epstein's dead and we're all looking at him and saying, yeah, he didn't kill himself. And we could tell that something else was going on there. But when but it almost feels closer when it's like, this could be happening to Bernie or Tulsi or any of these candidates that we were all supporting or voting for or whatever. It does feel like a conspiracy theory. But then when you stop and you say, yeah, but what about Epstein? Then it's like, well, okay. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's not totally a conspiracy. Maybe there is actually something more there, because it is very odd. I mean, the whole thing is just odd. I'm just still amazed that Joe Biden, somehow they got exactly what they wanted.
Yeah.
They got what they wanted, and there was no path for him. And somehow there was, magically.
Well, you rig the voting and you can get whatever you want, and it was that whole saying, don't ever be misled to think that the wealthy will let you vote them out. It won't happen. It just will not happen.
Well, not under the system. That's why there's no fixing the party. There's no fixing the system. You have to create a new system. That's why I'm such a staunch advocate for not reform, but for revolution in a way. And I'm not saying it has to be violent, but I mean, there is that famous quote, like, if you make it impossible peacefully, something's going to happen. And I think rather than having, something happen, I think all of the working class, whether you're a libertarian or Republican, a Democrat, whatever you are, a lot of us feel that the system is no longer serving us, that the system is rigged. And I can find a Republican and a Democrat to agree on that. And so what I think is the next move for people is to focus on that and say, you know what, I don't care what you believe in or who you voted for, but we need some sort of workers movement, because right now we're getting screwed over and over again and we still can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Well, Trump's slogans were right. We just have to actually implement it, drain the swamp. Right. There is a major swamp going on in Washington, and he played on the knowledge of all of the downsides that were going on, like America First. We're seeing right now during this pandemic exactly how damaging our globalism has been. The fact we don't have any manufacturing in this country anymore to manufacture masks and gear and sanitizer. I mean, things that is obviously now showing to be an issue of national security, and we have to now wait for China to send us all of these things. The fact, like, now we're starting to see, in a way, this kind of glaringly obvious, what Trump was pointing out during his campaign. Now we're starting to see, okay, turns out that there was something there. We need to drain the swamp, and we do need to focus on this country for a while. We need to build this country up. We need to get our shit together. I mean, and this is just exposing, this pandemic is just exposed on every single level how absolutely just bankrupt morally and ethically this country has been for so long, while we enrich the banks and Congress. You know, that whole meme. Did you guys see that? That was circulating on social media. It was Nancy Pelosi's freezer.
Oh yeah, we had it on our show the other day.
I mean,
she's showing her designer ice cream while people, and and that's the thing, Kim. I think we talk politically. The problem we have, the CARES Act also exposed everything. It should have been 94-2 over there in the Senate with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders saying, hell no. I mean, just today, the small business loans, they're out of money. And who got a hold of that money? Bigger businesses that had just under 500 people because they had the inside track with the bankers, hedge fund money, hedge fund managers got this money. So when you talk about draining the swamp, you go and hire Mnuchin. He was part of the fucking swamp.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's all just it is very eye-opening, and I do hope that more and more people are opening their eyes. I do agree. I think right now, I don't think people are going to follow Bernie Sanders towards Joe. Yeah, I just think, I do think there's a lot of people that'll feel like, well, but Trump, but Trump. But I think there's a lot more this time around that will say no. Yeah. But Trump, nothing. But Biden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Biden. But the Democratic Party.
You are seeing, I don't know if you noticed, but you're seeing a lot of the ex-Bernie staffers kind of part ways and actually speak out against what the campaign did wrong, and also against the idea that they have to vote for Joe Biden. And you're seeing a lot of the Bernie supporters online who were at one point, so for Bernie and loved him. You're saying, sorry, like they're just so angry because it's so eye-opening that it's kind of a fall from grace. Too many people put Bernie and Tulsi both on a pedestal, and we need to stop doing that with people. People put AOC on a pedestal.
Right.
People put like a lot of these politicians as celebrities, and what they're not. They're public servants. They serve you. For the longest time, it's almost been like, oh my God, we serve them. No, they serve you. We need to remind them of that. And I think the way to do it is to really be adamantly standing against being blackmailed and being manipulated emotionally, because that's what the Democratic Party does. Oh, you don't care about the kids in cages? How dare you not vote for Joe Biden?
You're privileged.
Without acknowledging that Joe Biden and Obama are the ones that started this whole thing, and are primarily a lot of the reasons why we have that mass immigration coming from countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, because of Hillary Clinton's foreign policy and the foreign policy from neoliberals and neocons, and that's what they need to start understanding. And if we don't stand up,
they're not going to understand that. They're not, because the media doesn't let them understand that. That's the big problem, is that you just turn on the mainstream news and what do you get? Yeah. It's just Trump bad all the time. And that's all they're hearing. And it's really, it is disheartening for sure. It feels like a battle that, I just get exhausted.
Yeah. But that's why shows like this, though, I think more importantly, the pandemic is allowing all of these masks to fall off, and the empire is crumbling. And I think now is the time to take advantage of that. And now people have more time to literally watch YouTube videos, to sit around and maybe look for more information. They're also angry. People who aren't political are angry that they can't pay their rent. They're angry that they're only getting $1,200 while Canadians are getting $2,000 a month. They're angry that they don't have healthcare. Like, they're thinking, wait, maybe, we should have had healthcare, because now, if I go to the hospital, I'm still going to have to pay for any sort of treatment I get. And so they're realizing a lot of these things that the media hasn't been talking about sort of apply. And I say that because I know people who aren't political that are like, holy crap, like, I don't want to pay my rent. I can't pay my rent. Like, what do I do now? I'm losing my job. They're starting to talk about these things because now it's directly affecting them.
Right.
And humans have a way of, that's the way we learn. It has to affect us for us to actually care.
It's strike time. It's general strike time. It's debt strike time. This is the only way we get out of this. People have to understand this. I know we can't take to the streets and stuff like that, but we can just stop. Like she said, stop voting, stop paying, stop doing anything. You can't throw all of us out of our houses, can you? I mean, millions and millions of people.
Right.
Eventually, we're going to come walking with pitchforks to the front of the lawn of the White House. So it's time that we really do stand up. And like she said, it's all these people getting affected. You know, even these small businesses. My friend called me today. There's no money left for them. What are they going to do?
Yeah, that's I know that a lot of people here in California are starting to feel like what's the point of living in this democratic state when we get absolutely nothing
Nothing.
for our
Yeah.
taxation?
Yeah.
I mean, we're taxed higher than anybody, and we're getting the same thing as the people in Texas are getting, but at least they don't pay income tax.
Exactly.
So they're getting what they pay for, but what are we getting for what we pay for? And then you see the news that just to infuriate, I mean, it will only infuriate people more when Gavin Newsom comes out and says, okay, I'm giving $100 million to undocumented immigrants, which I am in support of. I understand that they are the farmers and that there's a supply chain there that has to be that, you know, they definitely need money too because they're human and they're here. But at the same time, it's like, but what about all of the legal California residents who are here that are not getting anything? So it's like, it can't even be in conjunction that you do it together. Like, oh, by the way, you know, because a lot of people here in California didn't even qualify for the $1,200 because you have to make over 75 grand to live in most of LA. And so a lot of people didn't even, or San Francisco didn't even qualify for the $1,200. And then, you know, unemployment doesn't cover rent for people in LA when rent is as outrageous as it is.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's just a lot of, I'm hearing more and more just from neighbors that have always been liberal that definitely voted for Bernie Sanders, starting to feel that angst of what are Democrats actually doing for me?
Right.
Do they care about me at all? When the first thing our governor does in this state is take care of undocumented immigrants before he takes care of actual citizens of California.
Yeah. Well, how about the fact that it had to take a pandemic for him to do something about the homelessness problem that we had over here? Like, all of a sudden it's a national emergency because it's a pandemic. It should have been a national emergency day one. This is what a lot of people in California wanted to, was to help a lot of these homeless people who a lot of them are vets on our streets. It's ridiculous. We need to do something about it. But it takes a pandemic for you to react. Oh, so the money was there. You could have found it. You could have done it. But now, and that's before he even got the CARES Act money, he did something.
And not to mention on the undocumented thing, like it's like if you're creating a bigger divide, you're creating more hate because instead of doing both, which is what you should be doing,
done.
because
Done,
you said, undocumented workers help, especially California, our economy, which is the 5th largest economy.
They really help the whole country because we produce like 1/3 of the country's agriculture.
Exactly. So what you should be doing is helping both of the working class
at the same time.
At the same time.
Now all it did was just upset people.
Exactly.
You know, they're sitting there and they're reading the news and they're saying, what about me? What about my family? What about my kids?
That's how you create more racism. You foment more of this xenophobia. And that's not how it should be. But that's what these government officials are doing. And people like Gavin Newsom, I see way too many people preaching that he's this amazing guy, that he's doing such a great job simply for doing his work. The same thing with Andrew Cuomo, who is far even worse because he's cutting Medicaid, and people are trying to prop them up as potential presidential 2024 candidates. It's like, why? For them doing
what we need to do is we need to remind them of Rudy Giuliani. Be like, okay, during 9/11, remember, Rudy was great, but does that mean you want Rudy to be your president? You know, let's like really think about this.
Well, the eyes are on what's the money he's doing with the CARES Act, what Gavin Newsom gets a hold of that money. We're still waiting to see, does he give it to his big corporate friends or does he help the little guy out there, whatnot? He threw a little change what he said when it came to the undocumented workers, but we're trying to figure out where all that money is going to go. And rest assured, Kim, we'll see some of that money going to his big corporate friends up top, just the way Cuomo takes care of all of his billionaires. Gavin Newsom, Nancy Pelosi's nephew, you better believe he's tied in with corporations and big money, and more of that will reveal itself as it goes along.
Well, the only hope I have is that today they announced California announced their economic team, you know, to open up the economy here in California, and they are having it led by Tom Steyer. And I do know that Tom Steyer made the housing issue in California a big talking point.
He did.
He's very concerned about the costs that people are going through. So my only hope is that Tom Steyer comes out and says, we've got to do something for renters. We cannot let them pile up rent debts like this, that they have to pay back. Like, how are we going to pay those back?
Yeah. Well, that's the whole thing. If you print more currency, right, you devaluate the currency. What they could have done from the get-go was just do a mortgage freeze, rent freeze for
Right.
everybody.
They should have
for
just
90
froze
days.
all, exactly. They should have
Everybody.
stopped
90
time
days.
for all the banking and
It's just
said,
a
look,
freeze.
right, like we're just going to stop time and act like this time isn't happening. So then when we open back up, it starts all over again. But for
Yeah.
now, everybody goes for 90 days and you don't pay anything to anybody. It's just nothing gets paid.
That's it. Yeah.
And they didn't do that. And they instead have let the banks continue operating business as usual.
Yeah.
And that is just going to show how much our country, really the world, just is enslaved to the banks. We are indentured servants to the banks. Absolutely. That even during an absolute crisis where the government has shut down our jobs, we're told we still owe the banks.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and all the big boys got their cash. They had to sign a piece of paper. Literally, the application for these corporations for Ruth Chris was a piece of paper, and they got their money. But the small guy, the small businesses, is now just a buzzword for the Republicans. Or are they going to call their guy out, Donald Trump and Mnuchin, for this? They got nothing. And a bunch of small businesses will be closing, so we'll never go back to normal. It will be more consolidation of wealth going up to the top once again.
The good thing we're going to see out of all of this, though, I think, is the small businesses who are normally like, you know, oh yeah, like Republicans because Democrats suck. Like they're going to start seeing, wait a minute now, like we're getting screwed either way with Donald Trump or with a Democrat. And I think we're going to start seeing that, because a lot of the reasons why small businesses a lot of them have been Republican is because they think, you know, these Democrats don't look out for us, and they're right. You know, Bernie Sanders should have, that's one of the things I criticize about his campaign, should have focused more on small businesses, how you are going to help these small businesses. They are not under the same category as a corporation.
Right.
And so that this is an opportunity to get those people to realize you're being screwed by the entire system, by both the left and the right. And this is what happens when these politicians don't answer to us, they answer to these corporations.
The banks, they answer to the banks more than anybody. I mean, that's who they have running our government is, you know, Goldman Sachs. So, and I do think that this pandemic is starting to expose that to a lot of people, where they're starting to feel like, wait a minute, you know, what's going on here? I thought I was living in this, you know, like here in California, liberal oasis where we're all, you know, the state's blue and we're we're supposed to be taken care of like we're Sweden out here. And what are we getting for our taxation? I mean, that to me has been the biggest eye-opening thing. This pandemic has been so eye-opening that I will not live in this state anymore. Like as soon as my lease is up, I'm out of here. I cannot give them another dime. I just feel like it's immoral to keep giving money to the state when, and they're the most aggressive. The state is very, very aggressive about taxation.
Terrible.
And very, 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 way worse than the IRS by tenfold.
Oh yeah.
And yet, you know, what do we get during time of crisis? You know, it becomes glaringly obvious that no, we're not Scandinavia. We're not being, you know, and I don't mind paying high taxing. I like the Scandinavian model. That's what I want to live under. So I'm thinking maybe I'm moving to Sweden.
It's a great place. You'll love it.
Yeah, except it's cold. I like my sunshine and palm trees. That's the problem, right? That's the big problem.
Do they have good chocolate?
I think so, yeah.
Is it
Swedish chocolate? No, that's Swiss chocolate.
Sorry. So Sweden's not. They have good watches in Sweden, I think.
No, that's the Swiss too.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's Swiss watches.
Sweden has a halfway decent soccer team. Okay, let's leave it at that.
The bad thing about Scandinavia, they don't have good food. You know, they don't have the best weather.
Pickled stuff in Sweden.
Yeah, they have excellent government that really does work. Really they trust and works for the people. So,
what about Iceland?
Iceland's also all of Scandinavia. Like anywhere in the Scandinavian countries, they're just known for having the least corrupt governments. Yeah, they really hold their governments accountable. Like in Denmark, when the government they encourage everybody to ride their bike. And so in Denmark, everybody rides their bikes, and so do the government officials. Like their prime minister rides his bike to Parliament. Yeah, like that's how it works out there. So he's like, well, I've got to lead by example. If I say everybody should do it, I got to do it too. You know. Meanwhile, Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, she's showing you designer ice cream while she's applauding Juan Guaido, who's actually running against the guy who drove a bus.
You know who also showed people designer fridges? Kim Kardashian.
Oh yeah, my
Yeah, her
gosh.
multiple designer fridges. So Nancy Pelosi is literally Kim Kardashian this whole thing.
Yeah. Well,
That
Kim
tells you
Kardashian does
everything.
have an amazing
California.
Yeah.
refrigerator. I mean,
So
that her refrigerators were kind of like unbelievable. They were walk-in, they were entire rooms.
yeah, like a
And it was
restaurant.
like, right,
Yeah.
yeah, my bigger than restaurant
Yeah.
refrigerators is crazy. It's like, how much she gonna eat? Jeez.
How come people don't pick this up? How come people don't see how corrupt it is? She made all her money while she was in office.
Yeah.
Her, Feinstein, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. The only way to make that money when you're in public office is if you're corrupt.
You know, the thing is, though, is I bring this up to lifelong Democrats, and they make excuses. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like I
Yeah.
can talk as much sense as I possibly can into a lifelong Democrat, but when I tell them, you know, Nancy Pelosi has like 150 to 300 million dollars, I mean, something absurd, and they say, well, good investments, and it's like,
Oh,
how do you think she knew about the good investments? Do you think
good
maybe she was sitting in
investment.
on meetings and had some insider knowledge? You know, Martha Stewart went to jail for that, for insider trading, and
Yeah.
yet we
Yeah.
allow our government officials to get all of this information and continue to be involved in private business, and then we criticize Trump and say, well, he didn't sever off his ties. He's going to be president, he didn't sever off his ties. And it's like, you know who needs to sever off their conflicts of interest? It's Congress. They're the ones who make the laws.
Yep.
They're the ones who are supposed to be oversight for all of these different industries.
Yeah.
And yet, how, you know, I mean, they're able to run off with all this money, with all their investments and inside knowledge. Nobody bats an eyelash.
You know, the world is turned upside down when Martha Stewart's done more time than Snoop Dogg. It's just it's bad. Not that Snoop should have done a lot of time, but even a little time. But you know, still, it's once again.
Well, I'm not gonna. I'm all for it. I mean, sure, Martha went to jail, but I want the rest of them to go too. You know,
Oh my, I would
they're
love
all
to
the
see it.
white collar crime.
Love to
They've all
see
got
it.
to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, guys, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you for kind of giving us some insight into the rigging. It really just showing a lot of the inconsistency that allows for rigging. It
Yeah.
makes it easy to rig a game when it's too complicated for anybody to check
Order
your
by
work.
chaos.
Yeah.
And
Right.
maintain order by Candace. But that's why we got to fight for four things. We got to fight for transparency, open software, open source software, public counting, and 100% audit. If we get those four things, not just a paper ballot, we need both sides. So paper ballots just won't fix everything. We have to fix the whole system, Kim.
Yeah. But if we had a third party, we would be able to set our own rules for voting.
For our primary, yeah, for
Right,
sure.
for the primary. Yeah.
Yeah. But what's that
So-
third party going to look like? All right. We talk about I'm more in line with you. And I kind of say, well, I'm kind of in line with Kim. It can't just be on the left. It's got to be kind of around the center and the periphery. We have to
Right.
let people in the door that we didn't want to talk to last time and form a real third party.
Right. It's got to be a workers' party from and with people on both sides of the aisle. Otherwise, you're just going to cut into one side. What happens is and this is the history lesson from the Bull Moose Party from Teddy Roosevelt when it was the Progressive Party that was built by Republicans at the time. The issue was they split the Republican ticket and they kept splitting the Republican ticket and the Democrats kept winning. Nobody likes to be a loser for long. So eventually the people that were part of the Progressive Party fell back in line with the Republicans because they just were sick of losing. So that's why it has to be an even take from both sides in order to equally damage both parties. And that way it's not like one side keeps winning because one side's fractured.
Yeah. Well, if
Or
we can
four
get the
parties.
progressives to agree with us libertarians on certain things.
Well,
Right.
I'm just realistic. I just don't think we're going to be able to do that. I just don't think we're going to all be able to agree under one party. I think what needs to happen is
Well, but we never have. I mean, none of the parties agree with each other totally, right?
absolutely. But I just think we need a workers' movement, and from that movement, I think we can create multiple parties. I think a multiple party system is more going to be viable because there's so many. I mean, Greens fighting with socialists. I mean, I think the idea isn't to have everybody agree on everything. I think the idea is to have multiple parties have the ability to exist. If you want to exist in a party that is so inclusive, let that party exist. If Greens want to exist and have the viability, then let them exist.
But they do. And
letting
that's the problem
people
is that, these parties do exist. It's just that they don't get any momentum because they're too small. There's too many of them
And dysfunctional.
and dysfunctional.
Oh, the system doesn't allow them to.
You want a parliamentary system is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm more of along the lines of that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that would be good because if we moved to a parliamentary system, then parties, small parties like the Green Party, would be allowed to grow because people would start to see themselves represented, at least in Congress, right? Or in the parliament. But I don't know. In order to go to a parliamentary system, I think we have to change
the voting system. We have to get ranked choice voting in for that too as well. That's a whole nother element of our elections. The ranked choice voting actually paves the way for third parties to gain momentum and get in there.
Right.
So that's, like I said, when it comes to voting in elections, it's so nuanced. It's just not cut and dry.
Yeah.
Right. Well, guys, thank you again for being on. So where can people find you?
The Convo Couch. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram.
And Rockfin with you.
And,
Rockfin.
YouTube, of course. And we're also, it's at the Convo Couch, the Convo Couch. Don't forget the. And and we're always here. My Twitter is Fiorella_IM.
I'm at Yo Pasta.
All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for being on. You guys are really insightful. I always really like listening to you guys and following your tweets. And Fiorella always puts out a lot of really great stuff on Facebook that I read. And I always get a lot of information out of you guys. So thank you again for being on.
No
Thank
problem.
you for having
Kim,
us.
we're going to get you back on the trivia show because you're the only contestant to not score a point, and we don't want to let it go down like that. So we've talked about
never
it.
going to. No, you don't understand. I am horrible at trivia games. There's something about it, like the pressure, I just collapse. I've never, ever, I don't think I've ever gotten a trivia question correct in my entire life, no matter pub trivia, like for whatever reason, I have like a brain block with trivia.
So once the quarantine is off, we'll go to a real trivia game at a bar or something.
And you don't want me on your team. You will tell me to leave. You'll say you are not helpful here.
We'll carry you.
She even got the question wrong. Kim, what is your last name? I don't know.
I don't know. All right, guys. Thank you so much.